In abandoned Manila hospitals, three terrifying encounters shook their victims to the core. A student saw a corpse appear in a morgue that should have been empty. A nurse entered a sealed ward and never came out. Years later, explorers captured a ghostly nurse's reflection, though she wasn't there. A medical student dared to spend the night in the abandoned hospital's morgue as part of a fraternity initiation, expecting only dust and silence. But as the night deepened, he discovered he wasn't alone. Something unseen was shifting the body drawers, and when he finally turned to leave, one of them slowly slid open on its own, revealing a corpse that hadn't been there before. In 1975, in Manila, a medical student named Ramon stood before the rusted double doors of an abandoned hospital's morgue. His breath was steady, his resolve unshaken, at least for now. Tonight was not an ordinary night. It was the night of his fraternity initiation. The challenge was simple in its conception, yet fiendishly complex in its execution. Spend one entire night alone in the morgue of a hospital long abandoned, a place steeped in both tragedy and urban legend. For decades, whispers had circulated among the fraternity members about a strange presence that haunted those decaying halls. It was said that if you listened closely, you could hear the soft scraping of metal and the faint echo of footsteps that did not belong to any living soul. Ramon, both curious and eager to prove his mettle, had accepted this perilous dare. The hospital, once a grand institution that boasted modern facilities and compassionate care, had fallen into ruin after a series of inexplicable events and financial misfortunes. Its corridors, now choked with the detritus of neglect, told stories of life, loss, and unanswered questions. As Ramon approached the building, the humid night air carried the scent of decay mixed with an undercurrent of antiseptic remnants, a grim reminder of the lives once cared for within these walls. Pushing open the heavy rusted door, Ramon stepped into a lobby that was almost unrecognizable from its former glory. Crumbling plaster and shattered glass punctuated the silence. The faint, ghostly glow of the moon seeped in through broken windows, creating long, eerie shadows that danced along the floor. Every step he took resonated in the emptiness, a stark reminder that he was far from the bustling life of a medical student in a busy hospital. Tonight, he was an outsider in a realm where the dead whispered secrets of a forgotten past. He made his way through narrow hallways lined with peeling wallpaper and faded photographs of smiling faces that now seemed to watch him with sorrow and accusation. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Ramon's heart pounded steadily in his chest as he finally arrived at the entrance to the morgue. The door was heavy, its surface scarred with scratches and dents from decades of neglect. He paused for a moment, steeling himself for what lay beyond, and pushed it open. Inside, the morgue was a small, sterile room that had long since lost its sense of order. Rows of old metal body drawers, each marked with numbers that had faded with time, lined the walls. The tiled floor, once gleaming with cleanliness, was now mottled with stains and dust. A single lantern lay on a nearby table, its weak flame flickering and casting uneven light over the room. Ramon set the lantern on a makeshift table and took a deep breath. He had come prepared with nothing but his determination, a notebook, and an inner resolve to endure whatever might come his way. At first, the silence was almost comforting. Ramon settled into a corner, leaning his back against a cold concrete wall. He tried to calm his racing mind by recalling his studies in anatomy and pathology, subjects that had always grounded him in the logic of science. Yet, as minutes turned into hours, an unsettling sensation began to creep over him. It was as if he were not alone. The slight rustle of fabric, the distant echo of soft footsteps, these small anomalies nagged at his consciousness. As midnight drew near, the oppressive weight of solitude grew heavier. Ramon tried to convince himself that the eerie sensations were mere tricks of the mind, products of fear and isolation. But then, a sound shattered the fragile calm, a deep, guttural scrape, reminiscent of metal dragging against metal, reverberated through the morgue. Ramon's eyes snapped open. His pulse quickened as he scanned the dimly lit room. One of the drawers, the one closest to him, had shifted ever so slightly, barely an inch, yet unmistakable in its movement. His breath caught in his throat. With a trembling hand, he reached out toward the drawer, half expecting it to be nothing more than a result of his imagination. But as his fingers neared the cold metal, he felt a chill that went far beyond the room's temperature. He withdrew his hand quickly, his mind racing to rationalize what he had seen. "It's just an old, rusted mechanism," he muttered under his breath, trying to dismiss the terror rising within him. But deep down, he knew that this explanation was feeble in the face of what he was beginning to experience. Time seemed to slow as Ramon sat there, listening. The silence that followed was thick and unnerving, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water and the occasional groan of the old building settling into its decay. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, another noise emerged, a slow, deliberate tapping, as if unseen fingers were drumming against metal. Ramon's heart pounded louder. The sound seemed to echo from the far wall, where the drawers stood in eerie formation like sentinels guarding secrets of the past. With each passing minute, his unease deepened. He could not shake the feeling that eyes were watching him, that the very air vibrated with a silent warning. Compelled by a mix of terror and determination, Ramon stood up and moved toward the source of the sound. His legs felt weak, yet he pressed on, each step an act of defiance against the mounting dread. He reached a drawer marked with a number so faded it was barely legible. The closer he got, the more he noticed details he had previously overlooked. A thin layer of dust, disturbed in a pattern that suggested recent movement. Taking a deep breath, Ramon placed a shaking hand on the cool metal and slowly pulled the drawer open. The creak of metal on metal was loud in the stillness, echoing off the walls like a mournful cry. But inside, the drawer was empty. Relief, however, was short-lived. As he closed the drawer, Ramon could not ignore the sensation that something had been waiting inside, a presence that had stirred when the drawer was moved. His mind raced with questions. What could have caused that movement? Had he really seen something? Or was it merely the product of an overactive imagination fueled by the legends of this forsaken place? Unable to shake the gnawing feeling of dread, Ramon returned to his corner. He tried to sit, but sleep eluded him as his thoughts spiraled into dark possibilities. He remembered stories he had heard from upperclassmen, tales of strange occurrences and inexplicable phenomena within the hospital's walls. Some said that the building was cursed, that it was a gateway between the living and the dead. Others claimed that the spirits of those who had perished under mysterious circumstances still roamed the corridors, seeking solace or revenge. In his solitude, Ramon began to reflect on his own life. He had chosen medicine not only for the promise of knowledge, but also for the hope of healing, a hope that seemed so distant tonight. Memories of his childhood, when the world was simpler and the shadows were just playful shapes, now clashed violently with the grim reality he faced. The weight of expectation from his family, his professors, and his fraternity pressed upon him, and the initiation challenge felt like an unnecessary torment. Yet, he had agreed. The thought of backing out now was an affront to his pride and his future among his peers. As the night deepened, the unnatural stillness of the morgue began to warp into something more sinister. The sound of the tapping resumed, louder this time, accompanied by a series of soft, deliberate clicks that seemed to follow a rhythm. Ramon's eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of these sounds. Each drawer seemed to participate in this unsettling symphony, their metal surfaces creaking and groaning as if alive. His skin prickled, and a bead of sweat trickled down his temple despite the chill in the air. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and mounting terror, Ramon decided to explore further. He stepped away from his corner and walked slowly along the row of drawers. His lantern's weak light revealed nothing but the cold, unyielding metal of each compartment. But then, as he neared one drawer at the far end of the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a thin, shadowy outline that seemed to shift and pulse at the very edge of his vision. For a moment, he questioned whether his eyes were playing tricks on him. The outline faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him with a profound sense of loss and regret. As he paused, Ramon recalled a story his mentor once told him, a story of a doctor who had encountered inexplicable events in a similar setting. That doctor had spoken of a malevolent presence that preyed on the vulnerabilities of those who dared to enter the realm of death. Ramon shivered, feeling that the legacy of that tale was coming to life around him. The legends that had once seemed so distant and abstract were now all too real, manifesting in the shifting shadows and the haunting sounds echoing in the morgue. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Ramon's mind teetered between skepticism and fear. Every small sound, every slight movement of the drawers, gnawed at his sanity. At times, he attempted to focus on rational thoughts, reminding himself that he was a man of science, that logic and reason should prevail over superstition. But the atmosphere was insidious, undermining his confidence with every unexplained phenomenon. Then, as the clock neared the witching hour, an event unfolded that would shatter any remaining semblance of normalcy. Ramon, having gathered the courage to return to the drawer he had earlier inspected, felt a sudden and inexplicable urge to look again. His hand, still trembling, reached out for the cold handle. This time, however, as he pulled the drawer open, the sound that emanated from its opening was not the familiar creak of old metal. It was accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible moan, as if the very walls were exhaling a long-held secret. Inside the drawer lay something that defied explanation. There, nestled in the darkness, was a body, an arrangement of limbs and features that seemed both familiar and alien. The corpse was unnervingly still, its pallid skin stretched taut over a frame that resembled a medical student's physique. Ramon's breath hitched as he stared into the vacant eyes of the figure. For a moment, time froze. The room, the creaks of the drawers, even his own pounding heart all faded into insignificance in the face of this ghastly sight. Slowly, as if in a macabre dance, the corpse's eyes began to flutter open. They rolled in a way that was agonizingly deliberate, as if each movement was weighted by centuries of despair. Ramon could not tear his gaze away. The figure's mouth parted slightly, and in that silent moment, the faintest semblance of a smile appeared, a grin that was as chilling as it was inhuman. The sight was so surreal that Ramon questioned whether he was witnessing a nightmare born of exhaustion or a true defiance of nature. Panic surged through him. With a scream lodged in his throat, he recoiled, his body convulsing as he staggered backward. In that split second, the reality of his situation crashed over him. This was no mere initiation prank. This was something far darker, a manifestation of the inexplicable, a harbinger of doom that defied all scientific explanation. Driven by raw terror, Ramon bolted for the door. His lantern slipped from his grasp and shattered on the floor, plunging the room into darkness. The oppressive blackness was punctuated only by the sound of his ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of his heart. He could feel the presence of the figure closing in behind him, a predatory force that seemed to materialize from the very shadows. As he raced through the narrow corridors of the derelict hospital, every creak of the floorboards, every distant echo of movement, intensified his dread. The halls of the abandoned hospital were a labyrinth of decay. Ramon ran blindly, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridors as the building itself seemed to conspire against him. The oppressive atmosphere, laden with the stench of mildew and rust, made every breath a struggle. He could hear the phantom sounds of whispers and rustling, as if unseen entities were closing in on him. With every turn, his mind reeled, and he was forced to confront the possibility that he was not the only one navigating these haunted passageways. In a desperate bid for escape, Ramon burst through a door that led to a long-forgotten hallway. The corridor stretched into darkness, its walls lined with shattered mirrors that reflected distorted images of his terrified face. As he ran, he caught glimpses of movement in the peripheral shadows that darted and shifted, as if mocking his attempts to flee. Every sound was magnified: the clatter of his shoes, the distant drip of water, and that relentless, inexplicable scratching that seemed to follow him. At one point, Ramon paused in a narrow alcove, his back pressed against a cold, damp wall. His heart thundered in his chest as he tried to steady his breathing. He thought back to his training, to the countless hours he had spent studying the human body and its ailments. Yet, in this moment, all that knowledge seemed futile. He was confronted with a force that defied all explanation of force, that had reached out from the depths of death itself to claim him. The minutes stretched into an eternity as Ramon tried to navigate the maze-like corridors. Every turn led him deeper into the building's labyrinth of despair. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, and the oppressive silence was intermittently broken by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the soft echo of footsteps that were not his own. In one dimly lit corner, he stumbled upon an old medical records room. Papers were strewn across the floor, yellowed with age, and in the midst of the debris was an open ledger with handwritten notes detailing the hospital's most tragic case accounts of inexplicable deaths and mysterious disappearances that had plagued the institution long before its abandonment. Driven by the need for answers, Ramon pressed on, determined to piece together the mystery even as fear clawed at his sanity. The hospital itself seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its decaying walls whispering secrets of pain and regret. Every step he took was accompanied by a feeling of being observed by unseen eyes, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay and despair. The more he ventured, the more the building revealed its hidden history of doctors who had pushed the boundaries of science, of patients whose cries for help had been silenced by ambition, and of a darkness that refused to fade even in the light of day. At length, Ramon found himself at a set of ornate iron-bound doors that led to what appeared to be an old chapel attached to the hospital. The chapel, though long abandoned, retained vestiges of its former sanctity-stained glass windows that cast fractured patterns on the floor, and a heavy carved altar that dominated the room. Here, in this eerie sanctuary of sorrow, Ramon paused to collect his thoughts. The weight of his experiences bore down on him, and he felt a deep, gnawing terror that he had never known before. In the chapel's silence, memories of his past flooded back. He remembered the days when he was a child, attending church services filled with light and hope, when the idea of death was as distant and abstract as the stars in the night sky. Now, confronted with the harsh reality of mortality and the specter of an ancient evil, those memories seemed both a comfort and a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Ramon sank to his knees, his mind a chaotic jumble of scientific reasoning and raw primal fear. It was in that moment of vulnerability that a faint sound reached his ears, a sound that was unmistakably human. It was a soft murmur, like a whispered prayer, coming from the far end of the chapel. With his heart pounding in his ears, Ramon rose unsteadily and moved toward the sound. The beam of his salvaged lantern illuminated a figure standing near a shattered window. The figure was draped in tattered robes, its face hidden in shadow. Ramon's breath caught as he realized that the figure bore an uncanny resemblance to the corpse he had seen earlier, a mirror image of his own form, yet older, with eyes that held centuries of sorrow and malice. The spectral figure raised its head slowly, and for a long, agonizing moment, their eyes met. In that silent exchange, Ramon felt a surge of terror unlike anything he had ever experienced. The figure's eyes were deep pools of despair, and in them, Ramon saw not just his own reflection, but the faces of countless souls trapped within the building's cursed history. The figure opened its mouth, and in a voice that seemed to echo from beyond time, it spoke, "You cannot escape what has been set in motion." Before Ramon could react, the figure melted back into the shadows, leaving him with a mind reeling from questions and fears. He stumbled back into the corridor, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and dread. Who or what was this apparition? And what did it mean by what has been set in motion? The answers lay buried in the dark recesses of the hospital's past, and Ramon knew that if he was to survive the night, he would have to confront the secrets that lurked within these walls. The remainder of the night became a blur of horror and disjointed time. Ramon wandered through the decaying halls, each room revealing fragments of a grim history. Faded photographs of patients with vacant eyes, personal belongings left behind in a hurry, and handwritten notes scrawled on walls in desperate script. At one point, he discovered a hidden room tucked away behind a false wall. Inside, the remnants of medical equipment lay in disarray, and in the center of the room was a rusted operating table stained with dark, unidentifiable marks. The sight sent a fresh wave of nausea through him, and he could not shake the feeling that he had intruded upon a sacred place of suffering. As dawn approached, Ramon's mind was a battlefield of terror and rationality. Every unexplained sound, every shifting shadow, had chipped away at his once steadfast belief in science. Now, he was forced to acknowledge that there were forces in this world that defied logical explanation, forces that thrived in the liminal space between life and death. Exhausted and emotionally drained, he found a quiet corner in what remained of the hospital's library, a room filled with dusty books and decaying manuscripts. He sank into a worn armchair and allowed himself a moment of rest, even as the building creaked and groaned around him. In the dim light of early morning, as the first hints of sunlight struggled to penetrate the grime-covered windows, Ramon began to piece together the fragments of the night's terror. He recalled the spectral figure in the chapel, the haunted eyes of the corpse in the drawer, and the eerie tag that had appeared on his wrist. Each detail formed part of a tapestry of horror that defied simple explanation. The morgue tag, bearing his own name, was perhaps the most chilling of all, an indication that the forces at work had somehow intertwined his fate with the dark history of the hospital. Questions swirled in his mind. Was he merely a victim of an overactive imagination fueled by fear and isolation? Or had he truly encountered a malevolent force that reached out from the depths of death? And if so, what did it want with him? The more he pondered these questions, the deeper his sense of foreboding became. It was as if the very act of seeking answers only served to draw him further into the darkness. Unable to shake the lingering terror, Ramon resolved that he would leave the hospital at first light. Yet, as he prepared to make his escape, the building itself seemed to protest. Doors that he had passed earlier were now inexplicably sealed. Hallways that once led to the exit ended in impenetrable walls of decay. The oppressive silence was broken by a series of soft, measured knocks that echoed through the corridor's sound that, to his horror, resembled the steady beating of a heart. The realization struck him with paralyzing clarity. The hospital was not finished with him yet. Its malignant presence had claimed him, and escape was far more complicated than simply walking out a door. Desperation turned to frantic determination as Ramon retraced his steps. With every turn, the building seemed to rearrange itself, as if guided by an unseen hand intent on keeping him within its grasp. His mind raced with the possibility that the initiation challenge was a trap, set not merely as a test of courage, but as a right to bind him to the legacy of the damned. In his flight, he began to hear a persistent, echoing refrain, a soft murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was as if the voices of the long departed were speaking directly to him, warning him, pleading with him to understand the terrible cost of trespassing in this domain of the dead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ramon stumbled upon a set of heavy doors that led to the hospital's main exit. With trembling hands, he pushed them open and was met by the cool embrace of the early morning air. Gasping for breath, he fled into the street, leaving behind the cursed building that had imprinted its horror upon his soul. Outside, the world was strangely indifferent. Life went on, oblivious to the dark secrets that lay hidden behind those decaying walls. In the days that followed, Ramon found no solace in the light of day. The memory of that night haunted him relentlessly. His friends in the fraternity dismissed his account as a product of his overactive imagination, attributing the terrifying events to a combination of stress and exhaustion. Yet Ramon knew what he had experienced was real. At night, when the city fell silent and the memories of that cursed morgue resurfaced, he would awaken drenched in sweat, his mind filled with images of shifting drawers and hollow, accusing eyes. He spent long hours poring over old hospital records and local legends, searching for any clue that might explain the inexplicable. Among the yellowed pages of a forgotten journal, he uncovered references to a series of experimental procedures performed in the 1960s, saw a time when ambition and desperation drove a cadre of doctors to explore the boundaries between life and death. The entries spoke of patients who had vanished without a trace, of mysterious deaths that had been hastily covered up, and of a shadow that seemed to linger in the corners of the morgue long after the bodies were interred. The more Ramon read, the more he realized that his own fate might have been sealed long before he had ever set foot in that accursed place. Haunted by recurring nightmares and plagued by visions of the spectral figure, Ramon's life began to unravel. He found himself isolated from friends and colleagues, tormented by the constant fear that the darkness was following him even into the light of day. His once rational mind now grappled with the possibility that he was part of a larger, unfathomable design in which the line between the living and the dead had been irrevocably blurred. In a final, desperate attempt to reclaim his sanity, Ramon returned to the ruins of the hospital one last time. He believed that confronting the source of his torment might free him from the relentless grip of the past. Under the cover of night, he slipped back into the building, his steps measured and deliberate. The corridors welcomed him like an old malevolent friend, the silence punctuated by distant, indistinct whispers. This time, he moved with a grim determination, intent on uncovering every secret that had haunted him. In the derelict corridors, Ramon discovered a room that he had missed during his first frantic escape, a small chamber filled with relics of the hospital's forgotten history. Dust-covered medical instruments lay scattered on a table, and on the wall hung a faded portrait of a stern-looking doctor whose eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. As he studied the portrait, Ramon felt a chill run down his spine. Was this the man responsible for those horrific experiments? Had he been the architect of the terror that now clung to Ramon like a curse? In that moment, the room grew inexplicably cold, and a presence seemed to fill the space. Ramon's heart pounded as he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him. A low murmur rose in his ears, a soft, rhythmic chant that resonated with a primordial power. Unable to resist the pull of this dark energy, he began to search the room for any clue that might reveal the truth. Hidden in a dusty drawer, he found a leather-bound journal. Its pages, brittle with age, contained the confessions of a man who had once walked the thin line between genius and madness. The journal spoke of experiments that sought to bind the souls of the departed to the physical realm, of rituals performed in secret, and of a relentless force that fed on the fear of those who dared to challenge the natural order. Ramon read on, each word searing itself into his memory. The journal recounted the final days of the hospital, when patients began to vanish under mysterious circumstances, and the halls echoed with the cries of the damned. The doctor, whose portrait now loomed over him, had recorded his descent into darkness. confessing that he had unleashed something that could not be contained, a shadow that lived in the spaces between life and death. As Ramon absorbed the horrifying revelations, a single phrase leapt from the page. Once the shadow is awakened, it will seek the living to complete its circle. In that instant, the pieces of the puzzle began to align, and Ramon understood with bone-deep clarity that his fate had been intertwined with that of the hospital long before he had ever stepped through its doors. Tears mixed with sweat as he clutched the journal to his chest, a symbol of both his quest for truth and the unbearable burden of that truth. He realized that his presence in the morgue had not been an accident, but a meticulously orchestrated event of final initiation into a legacy of horror and despair that would forever haunt his soul. With the journal as his only solace, he left the chamber and wandered once more through the labyrinthine corridors, the echoes of the past whispering secrets in his ear. At last, as dawn crept over Manila, Ramon emerged from the ruins a broken man. The once proud medical student was now a husk of his former self, his eyes haunted by visions of shifting shadows and the unyielding specter of death. In the weeks that followed, he sought solace in the mundane routines of everyday life, but nothing could dispel the darkness that had taken root in his heart. The morgue, with its relentless legacy, had claimed him, even as the hospital was eventually demolished and replaced by new developments. Ramon found that the memory of that cursed night would never fade. In quiet moments, when the world fell silent and the night air grew heavy, he would feel a cold, inexorable presence by his side, a reminder that the shadow he had encountered was not confined to the ruins of an abandoned building. It had followed him into his dreams, into his waking hours, a constant, insidious reminder that some horrors are eternal. Now, years later, whispers persist among those who dare to speak of the events of that fateful night. Some claim that if you stand near the spot where the hospital once stood, you can still hear the faint sound of metal drawers shifting in the darkness. Others insist that the shadow of the morgue has not moved on, that it lingers on the fringes of our reality, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to cross its path. Ramon's story has become a cautionary tale among medical students and those who study the arcane intersections of life and death. His experience stands as a testament to the fact that some boundaries are never meant to be crossed, that the pursuit of forbidden knowledge can exact a terrible price. The morgue tag he discovered that night, with his own name inscribed upon it, remains a symbol of that irreversible memento moment when the line between the living and the dead was irrevocably blurred. Even now, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city of Manila seems to hold its breath, a question lingers in the minds of those who have heard his tale. Did Ramon truly escape the grasp of the morgue's dark legacy, or does his spirit remain bound to the remnants of a place that defies time and reason? For some, the answer is shrouded in mystery that continues to grow with each retelling of his harrowing ordeal. And so, the legend of the shadow in the morgue endures, a chilling reminder of the night when one man's quest for bravery opened a door that was never meant to be opened. Do you believe that Ramon ever truly left that place? Or does his restless spirit now wander the abandoned corridors, a ghost forever entwined with the darkness of the past? The answer, like the secrets of that night, remains hidden in the shadows, waiting, watching, and beckoning you to uncover the truth. Comment your thoughts, share your theories, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying challenges are not those we face in the realm of the living, but those that lie just beyond the veil of death. As Elena turned to leave the ward, the hallway behind her seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit now a distant, unreachable void. Then from the darkness, a brittle, whispering voice rasped her name, not in a plea, but in a knowing, guttural certainty, as if it had been waiting for her all along. In 1975, Deep within the labyrinthine corridors of an abandoned hospital in Manila, a young nurse named Elena found herself drawn to the dark heart of a place long forsaken by the living. Unlike her colleagues who shuddered at the mere mention of the hospital's old wards, Elena was compelled by a mixture of professional curiosity and a personal need to understand the tragic stories whispered among the hospital's ruins. The ward she sought was known simply as the Forgotten Ward, a section of the hospital that had been closed off decades earlier after a series of unexplained incidents and a string of inexplicable patient disappearances. On a humid evening in late October, Elena, clad in the modest uniform of a nurse, her eyes determined yet laced with apprehension, stepped through the iron-barred gate of the derelict hospital. The building loomed like a ghost from the past, its broken windows and crumbling facade testifying to years of neglect. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and dampness, and even before she crossed the threshold, Elena could feel the oppressive weight of the history that seeped from every brick. Inside, the hospital was a cavern of shadows and echoes. Elena moved cautiously along deserted corridors, lined with peeling paint and dusty remnants of what once were cheerful murals. Her footsteps stirred up small clouds of dust that danced in the sparse beams of light, filtering through gaps in the ceiling. Every creak of the old floorboards and every distant drip of water amplified her sense of isolation. For Elena, who had dedicated her life to healing, this place represented not only the decay of a once vibrant institution, but also a repository of sorrow and secrets that refused to die. Elena's destination was the Forgotten Ward, a section that had been sealed off following a scandal that the hospital administration had desperately tried to erase from public memory. Rumors persisted among the old staff and local residents that in the final days of the ward's operation, patients had vanished without explanation, and that their anguished cries could still be heard echoing through the darkened halls. Elena's resolve was as much personal as it was professional. Her late grandmother had once worked at this very hospital, and stories of her whispered accounts of inexplicable happenings had haunted Elena since childhood. Tonight, she intended to uncover the truth. After a long trek through winding corridors and abandoned patient rooms filled with relics of a bygone era, a tattered teddy bear, faded photographs, a rusted wheelchair, Elena finally reached a heavy, reinforced door with a tarnished plaque reading, "Forgotten Ward." The door, bolted and chained, bore the scars of desperate attempts at force and the ravages of time. With trembling hands, she retrieved a set of old keys that had been left to her by her grandmother, keys that were said to open any door in the hospital. The sound of metal against metal as the lock yielded was oddly loud in the heavy silence that pressed in around her. Beyond the door lay a corridor unlike any other in the hospital. The lights were dim, powered by a feeble emergency system that cast long, dancing shadows across the faded linoleum floor. The air here was chill, and a fine mist seemed to hover near the ground, as if the space itself exhaled the sorrow of its past. Patient rooms, once places of hope and recovery, were now transformed into shrines of despair. Beds lay unmade, and in some rooms, overturned chairs and scattered belongings hinted at a sudden, frantic evacuation. The silence was not complete. It was punctuated by soft, almost imperceptible sounds, a distant, mournful sob, the faint whisper of footsteps that did not belong to any living soul. Elena pressed forward, guided by a combination of trepidation and determination. She entered a room at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she was met with an overwhelming feeling of sorrow. The room was arranged like a patient's quarters, complete with a battered bed, a small table, and a single dusty window that framed a view of a desolate courtyard. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like faded red paint, were the words, "They are here." The message sent a chill down her spine, but Elena steeled herself, remembering her duty to seek the truth. As she moved from room to room, Elena discovered more unsettling signs of the ward's tragic history. In one room, a set of medical files lay scattered on the floor, their pages brittle and stained with what could only be tears or blood. She picked one up, and the faded handwriting detailed the desperate pleas of a patient who spoke of shadows that whispered in the dark, of unseen figures that visited in the dead of night. The entries were erratic, marked by increasing fear and paranoia until they ended abruptly. The air seemed to grow heavier as she read, and Elena felt as though invisible eyes were watching her every move. Venturing deeper into the ward, Elena reached what appeared to be the nurse's station, a small, cramped room cluttered with old ledgers, typewriters, and forgotten trinkets. It was here that she uncovered a journal belonging to a nurse who had worked in the ward during its final fateful days. The entries detailed disturbing events, unexplained power outages, phantom footsteps in the hallways, and, most horrifying of all, the sudden disappearance of several patients after a strange incident involving a burst of static that filled the ward. The nurse wrote of a night when the ward seemed to come alive with malevolent energy, a night when the boundary between the living and the dead was blurred beyond recognition. As Elena absorbed each harrowing detail, she couldn't help but feel that she was not alone in the room. An inexplicable pressure weighed upon her, as if the journal itself carried a curse. The deeper Elena ventured, the more palpable the presence of something beyond the ordinary became. In the central corridor of the ward, the dim emergency lights began to flicker, casting stuttering shadows that moved in ways that defied logic. The temperature dropped abruptly, and a low, mournful hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Elena's heart hammered in her chest as she followed the source of the hum to a narrow passage that led to an inner chamber. The passage was barely wide enough to allow her to squeeze through, and its walls were lined with peeling damp plaster that oozed with an unidentifiable substance. Every step she took in that claustrophobic space intensified her dread. At the end of the passage, she entered a room that was entirely different from the rest of the ward. This room, bathed in an otherworldly bluish glow, appeared to have been a place of ritual. Strange symbols were etched into the floor, and an array of archaic medical instruments, scalpels, forceps, and bizarre contraptions were arranged in a pattern that resembled an altar. In the center of the room lay a circular pool of water, its surface disturbingly still. The reflection that stared back at Elena from the pool was not entirely her own. For a fleeting moment, she saw the faint outline of a gaunt, sorrowful face hovering behind her reflection. She spun around, but nothing was there, only the oppressive darkness of the room. The encounter left her shaken, her mind reeling with the possibility that the ward was not merely haunted by memories, but by something that transcended the natural order. Unable to shake the feeling of being ensnared by the ward's dark history, Elena retreated back into the main corridor. Yet the further she walked, the more she sensed that the ward was alive with echoes of its tragic past. Whispers floated on the stale air, indistinct and desperate, as if the souls of the long-forgotten were attempting to communicate. In one instance, she could almost discern a plea for help, a soft, broken cry that sent shivers racing along her spine. It was as though the ward itself was imploring her to uncover the mystery behind its endless sorrow. As the night wore on, Elena's determination gave way to an overwhelming sense of dread. Her rational mind battled with the mounting evidence of the supernatural, and she began to question whether her quest for knowledge was worth the price of her sanity. The journal she had found at the nurse's station lay open in her trembling hands, its final entry urging her to never look back, and warning that those who disturbed forgotten would find themselves forever entwined with its fate. The words seemed to echo in her mind as she struggled to reconcile the rationality of her profession with the inexplicable horrors unfolding around her. At a turning point, Elena encountered what could only be described as a definitive sign of the ward's dark power. In a narrow hallway lined with patient rooms, the sound of footsteps, low, deliberate, and impossibly heavy began to follow her. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding like a drum, yet the footsteps persisted, matching her every stride. Desperation clawed at her as she tried to lose the unseen pursuer by darting into side rooms and taking sharp turns, but each attempt proved futile. The sound was inescapable, a constant reminder that she was not alone. Finally, she found herself in a dead-end corridor, the oppressive air pressing in from all sides. With nowhere left to run, she turned slowly to face the darkness. There, emerging from the shadows, was the unmistakable silhouette of a figure. Tall and gaunt, draped in what appeared to be the tattered remnants of a hospital gown, the figure moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied its otherworldly nature. Its face was obscured by a haze of shadow, but in the faint light, Elena could see eyes that burned with an eerie, otherworldly intensity. The figure did not speak, yet its presence communicated a message of profound sorrow and warning. In that moment, Elena understood that this was not a mere apparition, but a guardian of the ward's tragic history, a soul condemned to wander in eternal lament for the lives lost within these walls. With a silent plea, the figure raised a hand as if beckoning her to follow. Despite the terror that gripped her, Elena felt an irresistible pull, a compulsion to understand, to see the truth behind the veil of horror that had shrouded the forgotten ward. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped forward, following the spectral guide deeper into the recesses of the hospital. The figure led her through a series of winding corridors that Elena had never seen before. The architecture of these passages was markedly different, narrower, with walls that seemed to pulse as if alive. Every step felt as though it were echoing not just through the hallways, but through the very fabric of time. The atmosphere was thick with an inexplicable sadness, and Elena could feel the weight of countless unspoken regrets pressing down on her. After what felt like an eternity, the figure brought her to a heavy door, more ornate than any she had encountered in the hospital. Engraved with symbols that were both cryptic and haunting, the door exuded an aura of finality. With a slow, deliberate motion, the spectral guardian pushed the door open. Beyond lay a vast chamber bathed in an eerie luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very walls. At the center of the room, illuminated in a pale, otherworldly light, stood a large mirror framed in intricate, time-worn carvings. Elena approached the mirror with cautious reverence. As she gazed into its depths, she was met not with her own reflection, but with a tableau of the ward in its final moments. The mirror revealed images of frantic nurses, anguished patients, and a darkness that seeped into every corner of the room. Amid the chaos, she saw a figure, a doctor whose eyes were filled with a madness born of desperate ambition. The doctor was at the center of a ritual, surrounded by patients whose expressions were twisted in terror. The scene was chaotic and surreal, a snapshot of a moment when the natural order had been violently upended by forces that should never have been tampered with. The vision in the mirror sent a jolt through Elena's entire being. She realized that the ward had been the stage for experiments that straddled the boundary between life and death, a night when human ambition had collided with forces beyond comprehension, unleashing an evil that would haunt the institution for decades to come. The spectral guardian remained silent as Elena absorbed the weight of the revelation. In that mirror, she saw the faces of the lost, their eyes pleading for release from an eternal nightmare. Unable to tear herself away from the vision, Elena remained transfixed until the image slowly faded into darkness. When she blinked, her own reflection reappeared, but it was altered-etched with the deep lines of sorrow and understanding that only true horror can inflict. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was now irrevocably a part of the ward's legacy. The experiments, the tragedies, and the unyielding sorrow of that cursed night had left their mark on her soul. Determined to free herself from the ward's malignant influence, Elena resolved to uncover every detail of the dark ritual that had been performed and to expose the truth that had been hidden for so long. With renewed resolve, she retraced her steps back through the winding corridors, her mind awash with the revelations gleaned from the mirror. Every echo of her footsteps seemed to carry with it the voices of the departed, urging her to remember, to honor the victims of that fateful night. For hours, Elena combed through dusty records, forgotten ledgers, and personal diaries left behind in the recesses of the ward. Each document added another layer to the tapestry of tragedy, a story of human frailty, hubris, and the devastating consequences of meddling with forces beyond mortal understanding. The journal of a young intern, whose hopeful dreams had turned to despair, recounted how the doctor's experiments had aimed to create a bridge between life and death, only to shatter the barrier in ways that condemned many to eternal suffering. In the margins of the journal, desperate scrawls warned of a curse that would claim all who sought to unravel the secrets of the forgotten ward. As dawn began to break over Manila, the first tentative rays of sunlight filtered through the broken windows of the ward, illuminating the dust-laden air and casting long, mournful shadows on the floor. Elena emerged from the depths of the ward a changed woman. The horrors she had witnessed, the truths she had uncovered, had left an indelible mark on her soul. Though she had managed to escape the physical confines of the hospital, the memory of that night, the whispers, the spectral guide, the visions in the mirror would forever haunt her dreams. In the weeks that followed, Elena dedicated herself to bringing the dark history of the forgotten ward to light. She compiled her findings into a manuscript, carefully documenting every detail of the experiments, the ghostly apparitions, and the tragic fates of those who had been ensnared by the ward's curse. Her work, though met with skepticism by some, resonated deeply with those who had long suspected that the hospital's past was shrouded in more than mere neglect. Soon, her manuscript became a reference for others who sought to understand the intersection of science and the supernatural, a chilling testament to the dangers of venturing too far into the unknown. Yet, even as Elena found solace in her pursuit of truth, the echoes of the forgotten ward continued to visit her in the quiet moments of the night. In the silence before sleep, she could still hear the soft, rhythmic tapping of unseen hands, the mournful whispers of souls long lost, and the faint, sorrowful strains of a piano playing a dirge that no living person could compose. Her reflection in the mirror would sometimes linger a moment too long, as if the ward's legacy was trying to pull her back into its eternal embrace. Years later, Elena's account of the forgotten ward would become part of Manila's urban legend, a haunting narrative passed from one generation to the next. Those who visited the site, now reduced to rubble and memory, claimed to hear the faint echo of a nurse's footsteps and the distant cry of a soul yearning for release. Some even spoke of a spectral figure in a faded uniform roaming among the ruins, her eyes filled with both sorrow and defiance, reminder that the past, however dark, could never truly be buried. The legacy of the forgotten ward was not confined to the pages of Elena's manuscript or the crumbling remains of the hospital. It seeped into the very fabric of the city, a silent testament to the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered through the alleys of Manila, locals would pause and listen, half expecting to hear the soft echoes of footsteps, the murmur of long-forgotten voices, and the distant sound of a piano playing a melancholy tune. Elena's journey had begun as an attempt to uncover the truth behind the hospital's abandoned halls, but it ultimately revealed a deeper, more unsettling reality. That some mysteries are woven into the very soul of a place, and that the past, no matter how deeply it is buried, will always find a way to resurface. Her story, like that of the patients and doctors who had suffered in the ward, became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the quest for knowledge can sometimes lead to revelations that shatter the boundaries between life and death. Now, whenever someone speaks of the forgotten ward, they recall the brave nurse who dared to confront the echoes of a tortured past. Elena's legacy endures in every whispered rumor and every flicker of light seen in the ruins on a moonlit night. The ward's secrets remain, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul to venture into its depths and hear the echoes of history, a history that refuses to be forgotten. Do you dare listen to the whispers of the past? In the silence of the night, when the city sleeps, the echoes of the forgotten ward remind us that some stories are never truly over, and that every shadow holds a secret waiting to be discovered. A group of urban explorers ventured into the abandoned hospital, laughing off the stories of a ghostly nurse who still roamed its halls. As they snapped photos in the dimly lit corridors, they noticed a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform standing behind them in a mirror's reflection. Yet, when they turned around, she was nowhere to be found, and the reflection kept staring. In the summer of 1982, a group of urban explorers set their sights on the infamous abandoned hospital on the outskirts of Manila, a once grand establishment that had long been relegated to whispers and local legend. The building, with its sagging roof, shattered windows, and overgrown courtyards, stood as a monument to forgotten lives and unsolved mysteries. Despite the rumors that a ghostly nurse roamed its empty halls, the group, youthful and defiant, were eager to document their adventure, armed with cameras, flashlights, and an insatiable curiosity about the past. The group consisted of 5 friends. Marco, the unofficial leader, known for his fearless attitude and quick wit. Liza, whose passion for photography was matched only by her keen eye for detail. Ramon, a quiet and thoughtful soul with an interest in history. Bella, whose humor often masked her underlying anxiety. And June, the skeptic of the group, whose rationality clashed with the supernatural tales they were about to encounter. Their plan was simple: enter the hospital at dusk, explore its winding corridors, capture eerie images, and leave before nightfall if nothing inexplicable happened. As they approached the hospital, the fading light of dusk cast long, distorted shadows on the building's cracked facade. The grand entrance, once a symbol of hope and healing, now appeared as a foreboding gateway to another world. Marco led the way, pushing aside a rusted gate that groaned in protest, its sound swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The group's laughter and banter masked an undercurrent of unease. Even the most skeptical among them felt a chill as they stepped into the abandoned lobby. Inside, the remnants of the hospital's past lay scattered like fragments of a forgotten dream. Cracked tiles, peeling paint, and remnants of old signage hinted at a time when the corridors bustled with activity. The air was heavy with dust and decay, a tangible reminder of the passage of time. Liza's camera flashed intermittently as she documented every nook and cranny, her excited chatter mingling with the echo of their footsteps. Ramon paused frequently to trace his fingers along old, rusted doorknobs and faded plaques, pondering the lives that had once passed through these halls. Bella, usually the most cheerful of the group, found herself glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting the unseen to materialize from the shadows. It wasn't long before the group reached what was once the central corridor of the hospital. The corridor stretched before them, lined with closed patient rooms whose doors hung slightly ajar, revealing vague silhouettes of beds and broken furniture. Their flashlights illuminated ghostly images on the wall's faded murals and peeling wallpaper that hinted at happier times. As they ventured deeper, the playful banter gradually gave way to a tense silence, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the cavernous space. At the far end of the corridor, behind a heavy weathered door, lay the old nurse's station. Intrigued, Marco suggested they start there, expecting to find remnants of medical records and perhaps even personal effects of the hospital staff. When they pushed the door open, a cloud of dust billowed out, and the dim light revealed a room frozen in time. An old wooden desk cluttered with yellowed papers, antique filing cabinets, and a solitary mirror hanging on the wall. It was in that mirror that their first encounter with the legend occurred. Liza, ever the photographer, was drawn to the mirror's reflective surface. She positioned herself in front of it, snapping photos of the room. At first, the mirror simply captured their images, a group of friends illuminated by the weak beam of a flashlight. But as they reviewed the images on Liza's camera, a strange detail emerged. In the reflection, behind the group, stood a figure, a woman, in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. Her white dress was immaculate, her cap perfectly aligned on her head, and her eyes, dark and hollow, fixed intently on the explorers. The image was chilling, and when Liza turned to point out the figure, the corridor behind them was empty. "Did you see that?" Liza whispered, her voice trembling as she replayed the photo. The others crowded around the camera screen, their eyes widening in disbelief. June scoffed at the image, insisting it was a trick of the light or a stray reflection. But Marco's face was etched with concern, and even Bella's usual humor was replaced by an unspoken dread. Deciding to press on despite the unsettling discovery, the group left the nurse's station and began to explore the hospital's maze-like layout. Their path took them through winding corridors, past abandoned patient rooms filled with remnants of personal belongings, a child's toy here, a faded photograph there. Each room seemed to whisper stories of despair and hope long lost, and the group could not help but feel that they were trespassing on sacred ground. In one room, Ramon found an old logbook, its pages filled with handwritten notes that chronicled the daily lives of the hospital staff. Among the mundane entries were cryptic remarks about the nurse who never left, a figure described as ever present, her eyes filled with sorrow and duty. The note spoke of a nurse who had vanished under mysterious circumstances decades earlier, only to be seen wandering the halls, still tending to patients who no longer existed. The logbook hinted that she had been a beloved figure during her lifetime, known for her compassion and relentless work ethic, a nurse who had given everything to her patients, and perhaps in death, had become bound to the hospital itself. As the explorers absorbed the eerie lore, the hospital seemed to respond. The lights in the corridor flickered erratically, and a sudden draft of cold air swept through the hall, carrying with it the faint sound of a distant melodic lullaby, soft and melancholic, echoing through the empty rooms. Bella shivered, her eyes darting around as if expecting to see the spectral nurse appear at any moment. Marco suggested they split into smaller groups to cover more ground, though the idea only heightened their anxiety. June and Liza ventured down one corridor, while Marco, Ramon, and Bella took another. The division of the group allowed each pair to experience the oppressive atmosphere in a more intimate way. June, ever the skeptic, insisted on rational explanations for every creak and groan of the building. "It's just the wind and old pipes," he explained repeatedly, though even his voice wavered as they turned a corner and found themselves in a long, dark passageway lined with empty beds. Meanwhile, in the corridor with June and Liza, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The pair's flashlights darted across the walls, capturing fleeting images of Movementador that swung open on its own, a shadow that slithered away just as quickly as it appeared. Liza's camera was constantly at the ready, capturing every anomaly. Then, without warning, they heard a soft rustling behind them. June spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but nothing was there. Yet on the wall behind them, a reflection in a tarnished metal panel revealed the unmistakable outline of a woman in a nurse's uniform. Her presence was static and unnerving, as if she were trapped in time, her gaze locked on the intruders. In that moment, Liza's hand shook so violently that she dropped her camera, The clatter of the falling device seemed deafening in the quiet corridor. Jun reached out to help her, and as their eyes met, they both saw the reflection in the metal panel, now clearer than ever. The nurse's face was pale and sorrowful, her eyes seeming to follow their every move. Jun's rational mind rebelled at the sight, insisting it was an optical illusion. But Liza's voice, barely a whisper, pleaded, "She's here. She never left." Meanwhile, back with Marco, Ramon, and Bella, the trio explored a series of interconnected rooms that once served as operating theaters. The walls were adorned with peeling charts and faded photographs, and the silence was punctuated by the distant drip of water and the low hum of old machinery. As they moved through the space, Bella began to feel an inexplicable heaviness, as if an unseen presence was drawing near. Ramon, who had taken a keen interest in the building's history, recounted the tragic tale of the nurse from the logbook. Her name was Maria, a compassionate caregiver who had vanished under mysterious circumstances after the hospital was forced to close one of its wings due to a series of inexplicable accidents. According to the records, Maria had been seen wandering the halls even after her death, a spectral figure who continued to tend to the needs of those long gone. Their conversation was cut short by a sudden sharp sound of metallic clatter that echoed through the sterile halls. Marco rushed to a nearby window, but all he saw was his own reflection distorted by grime. However, when he looked back at his companions, he noticed something chilling. In the darkened reflection of a polished metal tray, the ghostly image of a nurse in a pristine uniform stood behind them. The figure's eyes were fixed on them, unblinking and mournful. Marco's heart pounded, and he called out, "Did you see that?" But when they turned, there was nothing but empty space. The eerie encounters escalated as the night wore on. The group reconvened in a central atrium, a vast hall with a high, crumbling ceiling and scattered remnants of what once might have been a place of healing. There, under the cold light of a single overhead lamp that miraculously still flickered, they gathered to share their experiences. Each of them had seen something haunting: gaze in a mirror, the persistent presence in a metal panel, the spectral figure in the reflection of a tray. The common thread in all their stories was unmistakable: the nurse who never left. Determined to uncover the truth behind these inexplicable events, the group agreed to split up once more. Their plan was to document every possible angle of the phenomenon, hoping that together their evidence would piece together the story of Maria, the ghostly nurse. Liza and June headed back to the corridor where the reflections had first appeared, while Marco, Ramon, and Bella returned to the nurse's station to search for more clues in the old records and personal effects left behind by the hospital staff. Liza and Jun, armed with cameras and recorders, retraced their steps. The corridor, now bathed in a dim, almost ethereal light from a stray beam of moonlight piercing through a broken window, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. As they paused to take another set of photographs, Liza noticed the mirror-like surface of an old, dented metal cabinet. In its reflection, she caught a glimpse of the nurse again. This time, the image was unmistakably a spectral woman in a vintage nurse's uniform, her expression one of deep sorrow and longing. Her eyes locked onto Liza's with a haunting intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Before Liza could react, the image shifted. The nurse's head tilted slightly as if studying them, and then the reflection faded, leaving only the empty corridor behind. Back at the nurse's station, Marco, Ramon, and Bella scoured through filing cabinets and dusty ledgers. In a tattered diary bound in cracked leather, they found a series of entries dated back to the late 1940s. The diary belonged to a nurse named Maria, whose heartfelt entries spoke of long nights, tending to the sick, and her unwavering commitment to her patients. However, as the pages turned, the tone shifted abruptly. Maria wrote of a strange occurrence a night when a patient had vanished, and she had heard a whispering voice urging her to remain in the hospital, to never leave. The final entry was the most disturbing. I have seen the light fade, and with it, I am bound here forever. I am the nurse who never left. The chilling confession sent a wave of cold dread through Marco, Ramon, and Bella. It was as if Maria's very soul had been captured in ink and paper, her fate sealed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Their discovery prompted the trio to search the building for any remnants of Maria's personal belongings, a name tag perhaps, or a photograph that might provide further insight into her tragic end. In a forgotten corner of the station, hidden under layers of dust and neglect, Bella uncovered an old, rusted name tag, emblazoned with the name Maria. The tag, though corroded by time, still bore an inscription that read, "In service to those in need." It was a silent testament to a life dedicated to caring for others, now reduced to a relic of sorrow and loss. As the night deepened, the paranormal occurrences intensified. Both groups began to experience a sense of being enveloped by an unseen presence, a weight that pressed down on their chests, making it difficult to breathe. The halls of the hospital seemed to close in around them, and the boundary between reality and the spectral realm blurred with every passing moment. Whispers echoed softly through the corridors, indistinct voices murmuring words that none could decipher. At times, the air itself seemed to shimmer with the residue of lost souls. Liza, unable to shake the image of the nurse's relentless gaze, found herself drawn to a particular room at the end of the corridor, a small, confined space that had once served as a storage closet for old linens. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and inside, amidst piles of moth-eaten fabrics, she discovered an assortment of personal items. A faded photograph of a young nurse smiling gently, a delicate silver locket, and a handwritten note that read, "I will watch over you, always." The note was signed simply with the initial M. Overwhelmed by emotion, Liza felt as though the nurse was reaching out to her, desperate to be remembered and freed from her eternal vigil. Jun, who had maintained his skeptical facade throughout the night, found himself grappling with doubts as the evidence mounted. The rational explanations he clung to, reflections, trickery of light, and mere coincidences began to crumble in the face of the palpable presence and the personal artifacts that bore Maria's mark. In a moment of rare vulnerability, he confided in Liza, "Maybe there's more to these stories than we thought. Perhaps she is still here, bound to this place by a promise or a curse." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden, spine-chilling sound, a slow, deliberate tapping that seemed to come from the very walls. Both Liza and June froze, their eyes searching the darkness for the source. In the mirror of a nearby cabinet, they saw it again. The nurse standing perfectly still, her eyes unblinking and her face etched with a sadness that transcended time. The apparition seemed to linger, as if unwilling to let go, her presence a silent plea for recognition. The sight was so profound that for a moment, the two explorers forgot to capture it with their cameras. They simply stared, transfixed by the spectral image that refused to vanish. Meanwhile, Marco, Ramon, and Bella, deep in their investigation of the nurse's station, began to notice peculiar phenomena of their own. The old radio that had been left on a dusty shelf suddenly crackled to life, emitting a faint broadcast that mimicked the static of a distant emergency signal. The sound was interspersed with a voice, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, yet laden with an undercurrent of despair. "I am here. I never left." The voice whispered repeatedly, as if caught in an endless loop. The trio exchanged uneasy glances, each of them feeling an inexplicable connection to the voice that seemed to echo from the very soul of the building. Ramon, whose interest in the hospital's tragic history had grown into a near-obsessive quest for truth, felt a surge of determination. "We need to document this," he insisted. "Every piece of evidence might help us understand what happened to her and why she is still here." Marco nodded in agreement, his earlier bravado replaced by a solemn resolve. Even Bella, who had been visibly shaken by the revelations in the nurse's station, agreed that the truth must be unearthed, no matter how dark it might be. The hours slipped by in a disorienting blur of spectral encounters, whispered confessions from the past, and the mounting terror of an unseen presence. The hospital itself seemed to come alive with memories, its every creak and groan a lament for the souls it had claimed. The group reconvened in the central atrium, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. They gathered around a makeshift display of the items they had collected: faded photograph of Maria, the rusted name tag, and fragments of the diary. In that moment, the legend of the nurse took on a personal, almost tangible form. Each of them felt the weight of her sorrow, the sense that Maria's spirit was not a vengeful force, but rather a tormented soul trapped by circumstances beyond her control. As dawn approached, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift, though the memory of the night's events remained seared into their minds. The group made their way to the exit, leaving behind the haunted corridors and echoing halls of the abandoned hospital. They emerged into the cool light of early morning, the urban landscape of Manila, coming back into focus, a stark contrast to the spectral realm they had just left. Yet even as they parted ways and returned to their everyday lives, the image of the nurse in the mirror lingered in their thoughts. Her sad, unblinking eyes seemed to follow them, a constant reminder that some spirits never truly leave. In the weeks and months that followed, the urban explorers would recount their experiences to anyone willing to listen. Their photos, once dismissed as mere tricks of light, gradually gained credibility as the details of the ghostly nurse became a fixture in local lore. Marco compiled their evidence into a small zine, distributing it at local gatherings and urban exploration meetups. Liza's photographs, capturing the haunting reflection of Maria, became iconic images in the burgeoning subculture of abandoned places. Even John, the skeptic, found himself revisiting the hospital in his dreams, his disbelief replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of forces that defied reason. For many in Manila, the story of the nurse who never left took on a life of its own, a cautionary tale for those who dared disturb the past. Locals claimed that on quiet, fog-laden nights, one could see a pale figure in a vintage nurse's uniform wandering the hospital ruins, her gaze both sorrowful and comforting. Some said she was searching for redemption, a way to finally rest after decades of wandering the halls of a place that had forgotten her sacrifice. Others believed she was a guardian, watching over the lost souls who once sought solace within the hospital's walls. As for the urban explorers, the experience forever altered their perception of reality. The nurse's silent, mournful vigil had shown them that some mysteries are not meant to be fully understood, that the boundaries between life and death are sometimes more porous than science would admit. And in the quiet moments of reflection, when the clamor of the city faded away, they could still feel her presence, as if she were a part of their own memories, a silent witness to the passage of time. The legend of Maria, the nurse who never left, continued to evolve with each retelling. Her story became a symbol of the many lives lost in the relentless march of time, a reminder that every forgotten soul has a story, and every story leaves an echo in the corridors of history. The abandoned hospital, with its crumbling walls and echoing halls, remained a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to connect with the past. And for those brave enough to venture into its depths, the ghostly nurse stood as both a warning and a Bacona reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones that reside in the spaces between light and shadow. Do you believe that Maria's spirit has finally found peace, or does she still wander the halls, forever bound to the legacy of a hospital that refused to let go? Share your thoughts, theories, and your own encounters with the inexplicable. The nurse who never left may be a ghost to some, but her story lives on, etched into the annals of urban legends and in the hearts of those who dared to look into the mirror and see beyond the veil of the ordinary.